Well, I've been waiting a while to talk about this one to see what else came out about it, but I think now's the time to get into it, especially given that the Prime Minister has confirmed it and the fact that he was aware of this major issue up to 10 months ago. A report from Global News, one of the more reliable outlets here in Canada, says that the Chinese government has been interfering with the Canadian elections since 2019, giving funds to members of parliament, placing people inside of members of parliament's offices to influence policy decisions, as well as trying to influence former Canadian officials so that they can get more influence in Ottawa.
Unfortunately, we're seeing the country's state actors from around the world, whether it's China or others, are continuing to play aggressive games with our institutions, with our democracies.
Now, I want to be clear that these are all allegations made by CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, as reported by Global News, and I'm going to do my best here just to relay this information to you without any personal bias or opinion. But let's get into the details, and make sure to subscribe to the channel if you want to continue getting Canadian updates just like this. The article begins by saying that CSIS has warned Prime Minister Trudeau that China has been allegedly targeting Canada with a campaign of foreign interference, including funding of a network of 11 federal candidates who ran in the 2019 election. This information was first presented to Prime Minister Trudeau as well as several different cabinet ministers back in January of 2022. And inside of this briefing, they were told that, well, members of parliament had received campaign contributions from the CCP, and that the members of the CCP, or at least agents, had been placed inside of the offices of MPs to influence policy, as well as trying to find former Canadian officials that they could co-opt and corrupt in order to gain more leverage and power and influence inside of Ottawa. This, of course, holds a lot of extra weight given the time that it was released, right? We have Trudeau as well as some of his foreign ministers actually attending the G20 summit, where they'll be face-to-face with many Chinese leaders. And in fact, at G20, which is just beginning now, Mélanie Joly, who is the foreign affairs minister in Canada, responded to questions about this interference, especially after she had just talked to her Chinese counterpart.
Well, you spoke with your Chinese counterpart. Mm-hmm. Did you bring up Chinese interference?
Yes, I did.
Elections? And what did they say?
So first and foremost, yes, thank you. So first and foremost, I've said it many times, and I've said it to my counterpart, we won't accept any form of meddling of foreign governments in our elections, and we won't tolerate any form of foreign interference at large in Canada, period. So it's not a discussion, it's intolerable. So that's our position.
What did they say back to you, though? What did they say back to you?
It's not a conversation, it's our position. Meanwhile, we will always make sure that as a government, our security agencies are working on this, are activated, that our law enforcement also agencies are working on this, because this is a top priority.
She says that in this discussion, it's not a conversation, and that their position is just that we cannot accept interference in Canadian elections. She doesn't share the response of her counterpart. However, there was a press conference that the counterpart held, but we'll get into that in just a second. One interesting thing to note is that while we don't know the identities of the people who accepted this money in 2019, the intelligence seems to say that these members were both from the Liberal and Conservative parties, according to sources with knowledge of the briefs. The report goes on to say that the funds were allegedly transferred through an Ontario provincial member of provincial parliament and a federal election candidate staffer, and separate sources aware of the situation said that this proxy group transferred around $250,000. Now, $250,000 in the grand scheme of multiple different election campaigns doesn't seem like all that much money, but when you consider what Canada's limits are on donations to political campaigns, currently being at $1,675 per year for an individual, you start to see, okay, this could have a little bit more impact, because we're not like the States where we have large lobbying and large payments going into these election campaigns. Another highlight is that CSIS didn't confirm whether or not they believe that this network and this funding actually successfully influenced the election results back in 2019, October 2019. But Trudeau, at the very least, has a response from just 2 days ago where he seems to believe that they were unsuccessful.
We've reported that CSIS gave you a briefing that in 2019 China interfered in the Canadian election. At the G20, you're going to be sitting beside Xi Jinping. Are you going to raise this issue with him?
Let me first highlight something that Canadians can be reassured by. We created a special independent commission made up of top officials and security experts to ensure that our elections continue to be free and fair in Canada. And in both the 2019 and 2021 elections, they reported that our elections unfolded with integrity. So Canadians, yes, why we need to be mindful about the real threats of foreign interference that exist at home and around the world. They can also be reassured that our institutions are strong, that our democracy is strong, and that we have measures in place to ensure that people know about it if anything does happen.
So there are a few important points here. The first one is that he says there's a committee during these elections that makes sure that there's not foreign interference in the elections, and that they determined at the time that there was no interference in the election, or at least no substantial interference that would actually cause an impact. But who knows if they actually had the information that was included inside of this CSIS briefing before they made those claims. He also then goes on to say that the Canadian institutions and democracy and the election system are strong and they are to be trusted by Canadians. Of course, this is something that any prime minister would say. You don't want to be the prime minister of a country where citizens are doubting the validity of elections. We've seen how that goes. And he finishes saying that we have systems in place to make sure that if things happen like this, that the Canadian public knows about it if they need to know about it. A little bit curious on whether or not, or what the criteria are to actually inform the public, especially given that Trudeau, as well as many cabinet ministers, knew about this back in January. The article continues to allege that Chinese intelligence agents conducted an in-depth background research into MPs who voted in favor of a very specific resolution that was happening in the House of Commons in 2021, and this was whether or not to declare the tragedies that are happening in Xinjiang, the northwestern province of China, against the Uyghur people, whether or not to classify this as a genocide or not. So folks who voted, or members of parliament who voted in favor of accepting this classification, it seems that the Chinese intelligence agents did a detailed background check into those MPs, but not just the MPs, into their local economies. Let me explain. They say that the individual ridings of these members of parliament were heavily studied by these agents, saying that they were taking a look at the industries and companies and which ones were present in their ridings and which companies had an economic link to China, with the objective being to judge whether or not China could leverage the local economies of Canadian politicians, seen as the CCP's enemies, sources said. This means that these Chinese actors allegedly looked at the different industries in the members of parliament's ridings to see if they had invested in them and if they had any leverage over those companies. If they were to have leverage over those companies, they could tell the companies, hey, you need to push back against this member of parliament and maybe even not support them in the next election. Now, in the wake of this report, there have been many responses, and one actually from China itself. Let me show you.
国与国之间的关系只能建立在相互尊重、平等互利的基础之上，中加关系也不例外。加方应该停止发表有损中加关系的言论。中方对加拿大的内政不感兴趣。
So the response was that China has no interest in the internal politics of Canada, and that Canada should stop making statements that suggest this if they truly want positive Canadian-Chinese relationships going forward. Meanwhile, just last night, the CBC had a segment where 3 different politicians from 3 different parties talked about this issue. Here's a take from a Liberal member of Parliament and then a Conservative member of Parliament.
Because it's important to remember that it's foreign interference. There are attempts made. That doesn't mean those attempts result in a, undermining of our elections or democracy. And it's a nonpartisan panel that makes that determination.
The Prime Minister hasn't even acknowledged the issue broadly. It's why we need to get those documents. It's why we need to get those documents in the control of the Prime Minister and of those cabinet ministers who were briefed. That was the issue. That is what is being covered up. And it really raises the question, What is it that the Prime Minister is afraid of? What is it that he is hiding from Canadians?
So the Liberal member of Parliament is saying, hey, there's this committee for a reason, and just because there are reports of interference in the election doesn't mean that they were successful in this interference. But on the other hand, the Conservative member of Parliament says, hey, we want to see the documents that were involved in this briefing that happened back in January. We don't trust that the Liberal government and Trudeau aren't covering something up and that they knew more than they're saying they did. Of course, there is a fine line to walk here with how much information is safe to go public and how much needs to be kept behind closed doors to make sure that this issue can be effectively dealt with. So there are a lot of different angles here and a lot of different claims, and it's all a little bit confusing as it stands right now. But of course, we're going to keep covering it on the channel when anything significant pops up, so make sure to subscribe. And I'm curious what you think about this whole situation. Is this as shocking to you as it was to me when I read about it last week? Let me know down in the comments below. And with all that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.